Hello, my name is Frank Boring. I'm an affiliate professor at Grand Valley State University, and we're about to have an interview for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project at Grand Valley State University. Welcome, Chaplain Keizer.
Thanks.
If we could begin with the basics, your name and where and when were you born?
Herman Keizer Jr. I was born in Chicago, and my birthday is May 21, 38.
1938.
So I'm now 77.
Well, I'm sure you've heard this many, many times before. You certainly don't look it. We have done an extended interview about your experiences in Vietnam. And so we're going to focus now on more specific elements of that experience. And then I'd like to move on to the current projects that you're involved in now. So put us in the time frame of when you actually got into the American military. What time period was this, and what were the circumstances that got you into the military?
Well, I'm the oldest of 7 kids, and so I had to pay my own way through school, and I went broke. And so after my 3rd year, I took some time off and lost my draft classification and got drafted. And I spent 2 years in the military as a chaplain's assistant at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. That was 1962 to 64.
Okay.
And then there was a 6-year commitment, so I had 4 years in the reserves. Okay. And I did those 4 years while I was in Calvin College and finishing up, and then in Calvin Seminary. And I graduated Calvin Seminary in 68 and was commissioned as a chaplain.
Okay. What was your intention of, we're talking about the Vietnam War is now going on.
Right.
What was your intention once you became a chaplain? What was it that you wanted to do?
Well, I almost decided not to go into the chaplaincy, even though I had really good vibes from the chaplains. They wanted me to come back, and but the war was getting so unpopular in '68 that I almost decided not to go in. But one of my professors said, no, you have to go back. I spent a lot of time teaching you about the just war theory, and somebody needs to be an advocate for some of these young soldiers, and you can be a good advocate.
Let's stop right there. If you could explain the just war theory.
Well, just war theory really has 3 parts. It's justice before war, and those are major political decisions. Like, you have to have a just cause, it has to be a last resort, you have to acknowledge the fact that you're committed to this and you're not going to use excessive force. And so those are all kind of political decisions that have to be made. And that really, in the Constitution of the United States, that's Congress's business. Then when you get into justice in war, you have 2 basic principles. And that's discrimination and, I forgot the other one right away.
What's the discrimination? I don't understand that.
Well, you have to only go after the military and not after civilians. And then you have proportionality as the other one. And proportionality really looks at not using excessive force to do what you need to do.
Okay.
And justice after war is the least developed part of that, because that deals with what do you do to establish peace. And we haven't really thought very much about that, because the treaty that we made after World War I really caused World War II, and the treaty that we made after the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, really caused the mess we're in right now, because we don't know how to deal with what are the issues of peace. Like, how do you, what kind of reparations do you want from the enemy? What kind of government do you want to establish? And all of those kind of things are just really not very clear.
Okay. So basically the people who had trained you to be a chaplain believed that you should go to Vietnam with that mission.
Right.
So tell us about your arrival in Vietnam. What were your duties originally?
Well, I was assigned to the 1st of the 26th Infantry Division in the first Infantry Division, and but it was about the time when they were the war was coming down, so they didn't really assign any more chaplains to the 1st because the 1st was going to go home. And so we started out with 5 chaplains, and 2 of them left, and so there were 3 of us left. And I was the senior, so I was the brigade chaplain for the 3rd Brigade. And then another Protestant took care of 2 units, and the Catholic priest and I took care of all the rest. And the commander was really good. He let us use a helicopter, and we had 2 hours blade time twice a week. Wow. And that's a lot of blade time, and we really could use that very well.
Now you're based out of Saigon?
No, we were based out of Lai Khe.
Lai Khe,
which
okay.
is just north of Saigon.
Okay. How close to the battle zones? How close was that to the battle zones?
Oh, the battle zones were all around us.
Okay.
I mean, we had attacks on Lai Khe. Lai Khe became known as the Rocket City because we were getting rockets all the time. And then we would go from there out to fire bases, and the fire bases were all around.
Could you explain what a fire base is?
Yeah, fire base is where the main concentration of troops is. And what's basically there is artillery and some soldiers protecting the artillery. But the artillery gives you the zone where you can really operate. If you get outside of that zone of artillery, you're really getting into a hurt because you're outside of any real indirect fire. And so they usually try to keep you within that realm, but they usually bulldoze everything and then put sandbags around the artillery pits. And when you go on a mission, you have a guy who knows how to call in artillery, and they do. And I was in one operation where we were really getting overrun, and so they called in artillery, and it was really close. We lost a couple of our own people to our own artillery. But going off from the fire bases was basically where the units were, and I would go off with the troops.
Okay. So you had an option, I take it, to be in Saigon and be able to just do church services on Sundays and whatnot, but I understand you opted to actually go out to minister to the men.
Yeah. My first commander said, you know, I don't want you to go out with the troops. And I said, well, why not? You know, I was in Lai Khe last night and 9 rockets landed. You know, is my God going to be any smaller if I get killed out there or killed in Lai Khe? And he says, what if I put you out there and I can't get you back the same day? I said, I'll stay and walk with the troops. I know how to hump. And so he became a good supporter of me because I was willing to go out and do that.
What I find interesting, and I'd be curious to know what your interaction with those troops were, you weren't just some shaved-tail chaplain walking in with all the trappings of religion. You actually were a soldier before you actually became a chaplain.
Yeah.
So did they know that? Did the troops know that?
Yeah, because, well, they knew I had a good conduct medal, and only enlisted folks get good conduct medals. And so they would see the good conduct medal, and they know that I was 2 years of undetected crime. But that was the thing that really let them know.
Yeah. Now I want to, as I mentioned earlier, we've done an extensive interview about your time in Vietnam, and so what can you tell us about your time in Cambodia?
Well, when we went into Cambodia, it was I was wounded there. We landed, and we sent the company in that was going to help set up the artillery. And then the next company went in and started building the perimeter. And then it went out when the next company came in. And so we had 4 different companies coming in and staying around the fire base to help build and then go out. And I went out with the first company, and we found what was a medical center where they had medical supplies, but it wasn't a hospital because there was no cemetery near it. And then we found a training area for zappers.
What are
And
those?
a zapper is the kind of guy who's trained to go under the wire and defuse all of the different kinds of signals you might have and the weapons you have with under the wire, and get inside the base camp and then start putting plastic charges and everything on the first bunkers they see. And so I told the commander, I says, "Sir, we're going to get hit." And so he went out with me and he saw what was there and he said, "Yeah, I think we're going to get hit." And 2 nights later we did get hit, and I was sleeping naked because I was getting crotch rot and all that kind of stuff. So the rocket came in and blew my
Your cot?
yeah. Well, I was sleeping on an air mattress, but and that just went because of the pressure, and I had a concussion and a skull fracture, but my flak jacket was all messed up. My helmet was okay. So the guy sleeping with me was a lieutenant. He was going to go down into the Tactical Operations Center, so he didn't need his flak jacket. So he gave me his flak jacket, and I went out and started dragging some troops to the doc's tent who were wounded, and one of the guys in the artillery was sleeping on a cot, and the back of his head was blown. So I gave him a tracheotomy and put some cut down and put an IV in, and we got quite a few guys got hurt. Yeah. And when we took them all out in the morning, the doc said, "You got to go too." And I said, "No, we got to stay here and do a memorial service." And so he said, "Okay, I'll take care of you here." So he did.
So you ended up in a hospital, though, didn't you? Did you go after for the concussion? You had to go somewhere.
No, I stayed out there in the field. I went to the hospital when I was wounded the second time.
Was there any talk about after the first battle that you went that battle where you got injured and had the concussion? Was there any talk about sending you back home?
No, not the first one.
Okay.
Because I wasn't that badly injured. Okay. I think, the concussion and everything now is much more prevalent in this war than it was in Vietnam, yeah. And they were much more aware of what kind of damage right. that can be done to the brain than we were during that time.
But what kind of decorations were given to you based on that experience? Because you have quite a few on your uniform.
Yeah, I was put in for a Silver Star, but they downgraded it to a Bronze Star with V. Okay. And so I ended up with 6 Bronze Stars after 10 months in Vietnam.
How many chaplains usually get Bronze Stars?
Not many. And not 6. Yeah.
Now, there was an incident, and I'm not sure if it was before An Khê, but that involved something you observed. You were in a convoy, I understand, and the point person who had the gun watched a 10-year-old girl come forward. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I was in the second deuce and a half, and every one of the trucks had at least one person who had ammunition in his weapon and was really the guard for the truck. Mm-hmm. And we were going along through a town, and this young girl went running up towards the truck ahead of us and threw a fragmentation grenade in the truck. And the guy who was in our truck shot her. And then after he killed her, he just started to cry like crazy. He said, "Chaplain, I have an 11-year-old daughter at home too." So he was really mortified by what he had done. And I spent all night with him and let him cry and try to talk and let him get to talking about how he felt about that incident.
Yeah. Now, at some point you were transferred to Ankei. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, I was with the 1st Division. When the 1st Division went home, they were going to assign me to a rear area. And I got a call from the 4th Infantry Division chaplain, and he said, "Chaplain Keizer, I understand you're a good troop chaplain. And how would you like to spend the rest of your time out in the field with some more troops?" He said, "I got a real unit here that really needs a troop chaplain. And they right now have a major promotable as the commander. And he's a good guy, but he's a friend of the generals. And so all of the other lieutenant colonels who want to command were not getting it. And so he's taking a lot of flack, but he's got a unit that the former commander just did not do very well with." And he said, "Would you come up?" And I said, "Yeah, okay, I will." So I went up to Pleiku, and that's where we were at that time. And I was about 105 pounds, and good fighting weight, I guess. And then I went to, I stayed at the base for a while, and I wrote a program that had an amnesty for drug abusers for the entire division, because I had that in the 3rd Brigade in the 1st Division. And then I went and joined the unit that I was going to be with. It was the 22nd, and they were the regulars, by God.
Okay.
And so I thought that was pretty nice. On my Jeep, I had regulars, by God. And I thought it was a pretty religious organization.
Yeah. Let me back up for a moment. You mentioned that you had to write a paper on drug abuse. Can you elaborate on why you had to do that?
Well, we were getting a lot of guys from all over the United States who were getting hooked on drugs in Vietnam, and the drugs in Vietnam were really good. I mean, they were 99% real drugs. And so the habit you had in Vietnam, where it might cost $10, in the United States it cost you $10,000 to get the same kind of stuff. And President Nixon had started a urine analysis program. And so I just told the guys, and I told the commander, I says, we can rehabilitate a lot of these guys, because most of them don't have the capacity to take care of a drug problem back in the United States. Most of them are hicks. They're not street smarts. And so they're not going to, I can see them running down the street with a TV under their arms that they sold someplace, but that's not the way you're going to support a drug habit in the United States. So we started an amnesty program where guys, if they were having problems with drugs, they could come to me or one of the docs and say, I need to go into and get cleaned up a little bit.
Now, we're talking about heroin here.
Yep.
Because marijuana was also available, but we're talking a serious drug like heroin.
Yep.
It was 99% or whatever percentage, doesn't matter, pure, whereas in the United States it's cut down so much that you'd have to do a lot more to get the same kind of effect. Why were men doing drugs in Vietnam?
Well, because the war was terrible. I mean, it was really a bad war. And especially around 68, 69, 70, it was really unpopular in the States. And all kinds of stuff was going on. And the troops were just very, very disheartened. And the drugs were available, and you could get them easy enough. And that was a way to take away some of the pain of being in a war that was not popular, a war that you really didn't think was right, and a war that was really fought mostly in the South. And that was the country we were supposed to be defending, and yet that's the country that we were really rooting by all of our Agent Orange and bombs and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I don't think I asked you this in the original interview. What were you thinking about the war at that time? What were your thoughts about the war?
Well, I really thought that the tactics and strategy that we were about was really bad. I mean, we would throw leaflets out on a field and say, "This is now open territory. If we see anybody moving here, we're gonna shoot them." And so, here farmers were there trying to take care of their farms, and so during the day, if they were out there, they could get seen and killed. So they would go out at night, and at night they were just presupposed to be the enemy, and it was search and destroy, and that became Westmoreland's War, and the tactics and strategy were just not really very moral.
And the men that had to carry it out weren't quite sure what they were doing there to begin with.
Right.
I think an important point, and it's sad for me to have to bring this up because you would think everybody would know that during that period of time it wasn't a volunteer army.
No.
You got drafted at 18.
Yeah.
And at that time also, when was the age for voting?
Yeah.
21.
Right.
And so part of what was going on in the United States, especially on college campuses, was that I can't even vote against this war or for this war, and yet I got to go. At some point, too, the college deferment was set aside, right?
Right.
And that's probably what launched the college rebellions, because all of a sudden it was directly affecting them.
Yeah, and then when they went to the lottery system and all of that, it was just, if your number came up, that was it. You couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of, and there's always been a distinction in the non-volunteer army between those guys who were RA, who volunteered to go in, and the U.S. guys who were drafted. Mm-hmm. And I think the guys who were drafted had a tremendous influence in keeping some of this stuff down, because nobody wanted to mess with a guy who was drafted, who was going to write his senator and his congressman about what was going on in the war. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't say to you, "Hey, you volunteered for this shit." Mm-hmm. So it was, and I wish the draft would come back.
It might stop a few things.
Yep.
What were some of the things that you're a chaplain and you have devoted your life to the moral life and in helping other people with trying to become good people? What were some of the things that you witnessed when you were there that you saw, that you recognized this is wrong and I'm on the side that's doing the wrong?
Well, one of the things was I had 3 people come to me who wanted to be conscientious objectors. And one was a senior non-commissioned officer who had a Silver Star and Purple Heart. And while he was in non-commissioned officer school, he started thinking seriously about the just war theory. And he was very much opposed to the search and destroy kind of things that were going on with the tactics that we had. So he wasn't objecting to why we were there or anything. He was just objecting as a soldier to what was going on in terms of discrimination and proportionality. And so he said, I want to be a conscientious objector. Well, the Department of Defense regulation only acknowledges pacifists, and he's not a pacifist. I mean, he'd been to Vietnam 3 times. So I helped him write up his paperwork, and they turned him down in Washington. And he really, they sent him to jail.
With a Silver Star and a Purple Heart.
Yeah. And he had, but none of his objections, the moral objections, ever got before the court-martial, because All they were trying him on was that fact that he did have a direct order to take up his weapon, and he didn't do it. So that was the whole part of the trial. Then I had two enlisted men, and they objected to the same things, and I helped them write a paper. And one came back, both of them came back, no, you can't be a conscientious objector. One decided he was not going to fire his weapon and went to jail too. The other one said, I'm not going to go to jail. I'm going to stay here, but I'm not going to shoot my weapon. And he was in a firefight one time, and he had an opportunity to kill, and that person who he didn't kill killed two of his friends. And so he came back to the fire base, and he was a moral basket case. And some of the guys who did interrogations, they would take guys up in a helicopter and throw one out, and the other guy would talk. And so there was a lot of stuff going on that I just did not feel was morally right. And some of the guys were really having difficulties with that and not being able to talk about it. And when they would even talk to me, it was very, very difficult for them to put into words exactly what they were feeling.
I guess the part that has always bothered me, amongst many things about that war, is that the people who were directing it to happen were not in the line of fire at all. It was these kids that were literally forced to go out there, and it gets back to what you were talking about with this just war theory that we supposedly are adhering to, and yet you were witnessing, they were witnessing that very thing being done. And what are we trying to do here? We're trying to free up a people to give them a good way of life, and this is how we're demonstrating it through our military.
Yeah, many of the senior non-commissioned officers never went out into the field. So the guys who were buck sergeants were really running the war with lieutenants. And the two commanders that I worked with, two lieutenant colonels, they would go out in the field. But I never saw a general officer take a chance to do anything. If they got hurt, they got shot down in their helicopter that was standing up on top of 3 other levels of helicopters running the battle. So it was a war that was really fought not by the professional army, but by the drafted army.
Yeah. Now you had an incident on K that had to do with a helicopter.
Yeah.
And I'm amazed that I'm sitting in this room in WKTV studio talking to you, but let's hear about that story if you would.
Well, when we went to Ankh, we took over from the first CAV, and the first CAV was all helicopters. And so there was a lot of helicopter pads and everything. But the one we had, the pilot had to get up into a hover and then kick around and go out this way. And we decided, no, we were going to build one where he could come in and he could kick straight out. It's much safer, and
there's no doors, right?
Yeah,
yeah,
and it's easier to do. But he forgot where he was. He was talking to me and leaning over, and I think it just went out of his head that he could now go out straight. So he got up in a hover, kicked around, and went out, and all of a sudden he saw high tension wires and pulled back on a joystick, and the high tension wires hit the rear rotor blades and knocked them off. And without the rear rotor blades, the helicopter goes like this. And I was sitting with my feet hanging out because we were going to go into a resupply place, and I was going to do a memorial service. And so I was on the outside of the centrifugal force and was thrown out. When the pilot came to see me in the hospital, he said, my altimeter was at about 175 feet, and I saw you go out on the bubble, so you must have fallen 150 feet. And I hit elephant grass, and thank God there was no big stones in the elephant grass, because that really is heavy stuff and sharp. And I tumbled, they said, for about 50 or 60 meters. And so I went in and I did that tumble routine that I learned in high school. But I broke this wrist the ulna, the elbow, the humerus, dislocated this shoulder, broke this wrist, shattered this, dislocated this, broke this, and dislocated that. So my arms were really my shock absorbers. And so that put me out of Vietnam.
Yeah, I kind of picture the cartoon, the classic cartoon about the person coming to see the guy in the hospital bed, but he's literally in cast, right?
Right.
How long did it take you to recover, so to speak?
Oh, a good 5 months,
Okay.
because I spent some time in Camp Zama, Japan, and then they brought me to Chicago because my folks lived in Chicago and my wife lived in Grand Rapids. And so I was at the Naval Hospital in Chicago,
Okay.
Great Lakes.
Chaplain Keizer, when you're laid up like that, you imagine don't have a whole lot to do but reflect and think. What were some of the things that you were thinking about after you're forced to lay there. You've just been from Vietnam. You experienced all this stuff. What were you thinking about?
Well, one, I had survivor guilt. I wish I was back with my troops because I thought I was doing a better job than some other chaplains were. And I had seen guys get killed just by lighting a cigarette at night and a sniper hitting them. And my surviving a fall of 150 feet was, that's a miracle. And so I thought about that a lot and was guilty for surviving. And then I also thought about some of the moral issues that were facing some of these guys. And I talked a lot with some of the men who came around, but it was trying to concentrate on not being able to feed yourself, wipe yourself, and any of that stuff. My wife had a 9-month-old baby while we were there, so when I came home, I had both arms in cast, and she set my son in my lap, and he didn't know what to do with this guy with the white arms that were hard. And then she called me her other baby, and it took me about 5 years to finally confront her about that. But, it's a very humiliating kind of experience because you can't do anything. When I finally could feed myself in the hospital, they took the cast off so that this elbow was a little free. We had chicken, potatoes, and peas. Well, I did great with the chicken and potatoes, but the peas were all over the table, onto the floor. The nurse came in and said, "Chaplain Keizer, what did you do?" And I got so happy to feed myself, I peed all over your floor. So she put that in her nursing notes. And the next day, the admiral comes down and sneaks his head around the corner. He says, "Chaplain Keizer, what did you do last night?" But that was the only way you had any kind of comic relief.
What was your next tour of duty, so to speak? And you were still in the military, right? So
Right.
what did you, once you healed, what were you going to do next?
I was a hospital chaplain at Fort Carson in Colorado. And part of the reason I got that assignment was the physical therapist was right across the office from where my office was. So I used to go in and see the physical terrorists, I called them, and at least twice, 3 times a day, and they would manipulate my arms to help get them to bend. And they never were able to get this right wrist to be able to do anything with pronation or supination, so they did more surgery and they cut the bone off here. So when I sing that song, "This bone's connected to that bone," right there I have a musical interlude.
Once you were in Colorado, what year are we talking about now? Was the war already ending or has it ended?
Well, that was 70, 71 and 72.
Okay. All right. So it was ending.
It was ending, but it was still going on. It didn't end
Yeah.
until 75.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, what, being the chaplain at a hospital, obviously you had a lot of experience of being in a hospital, and so you're ministering to the, is this just the sick, or is these people actually coming from Vietnam?
No, most of them were sick.
Okay.
And some cancer patients. And one of the guys who worked in the physical therapy clinic, he contacted cancer. And it became terminal. They were going to send him up to Denver, and he didn't want to go to Denver. So I talked to the commander, and we talked the commander into keeping him at this hospital so he could be with his family. And when he passed away, his wife and I gave him a bath and got him ready to go down to the morgue. And the nurses were kind of leery about that, but you know, I explained to them that, you know, this is the last opportunity that she has to really do something for her husband, and she wanted to do that very much.
Were you following the events in Vietnam? Now that you were kind of in the States and have a different job completely, were you following what was going on over there?
Yes.
What were your thoughts about it?
Well, I wanted to really try to do something for people who were having real moral issues with the war. And so I began to work very hard on selective conscientious objection. And so I wrote several papers to Congress, and I wrote to my church. My church has had that position since before the First World War. And because the just war theory says there can be unjust wars, and if there's an unjust war, you have to object to it. And the UCMJ also provides for the ability to not follow orders, but that takes a lot of guts. When you're in the battle, your commander says to do something and you say no. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to stand up to him. Whereas if you go into selective conscientious objection, you go really before your draft board. And I think there were many selective conscientious objectors who local draft boards had let out, but it wasn't part of the Department of Defense regulation. Because I know a couple of professors at Kelvin, their children got out because they wrote some really good stuff, but it went before the local draft board, and there were other friends of the families and stuff on there, so they were able to get classified as conscientious objectors.
But you were in Colorado, though. You said most of the ones that you had there were sick and not actually from Vietnam. So you're doing this, writing these papers and whatnot, just as a how do I want to put this? You're not dealing directly with the Vietnam veterans at this point, right? You're just writing it because you have a moral objection to what's going on, and you're trying to make people recognize that this is a real problem.
Yeah.
So what was their reactions? What kind of response did you get?
Well, several officers took objection to my writing some of those, and they kind of put pressure on me. But the commanding general of the post, his dad was a chief of chaplains at one time. And so he understood what chaplains were supposed to do. And we had about 50 chaplains on the post, and there were only 3 that he thought were good, because we all had to meet the standard of his dad. And so one black chaplain, one Episcopal chaplain, and me were the 3 that he thought was okay. So I could talk to him about a lot of things. And then the drug and alcohol program really started out. And the general asked me if I would do that. So I wrote a regulation for the installation. I put together a Manning document. I showed it to him, and he said, "Oh, this is great. You got to go." And I said, "Before I go, the first thing I want you to do is to send your deputy, because he's an alcoholic." And the general says, "You want me to send him where?" I says, "Well, there's a good AA in Colorado Springs that's got a lot of executives in it, and they don't tell anybody, but they really are a good, tight group. And I think your deputy needs to go." He was a one-star general. And so he said, "Okay." So he got the general, called him in, and we talked to him. And I brought him down to the AA, and he stayed sober for 10 years. And then in Germany, he got drunk and killed himself in a car accident. But the drug and alcohol thing really became something that I did a lot of work in, and they liked my plan so much that pretty soon it made its way all the way to Washington, and it became the basis for the Army drug and alcohol program.
Once you did that, did you have a mission in mind? Did you have a plan in mind when you were going to get out of the military? Or did you plan to stay in the military until you retired?
Well, I was going to stay until I retired, but then it was 20 years because they had a two-tier system in the military at that time where you had each denomination had a quota for regular Army, but they needed more chaplains than a quota for regular Army, so they had other chaplains come in who were not regular, and they could only serve 20 years. The regular guys could serve 30 if they made colonel. And while I was teaching at the chaplain school, that changed, and so everybody now was regular Army. So I could stay beyond 20 if I wanted to. And I had some really good jobs, so I decided to stay in. And then I reached maximum retirement at 30, but I was working on a special program for the Secretary of the Army that was dealing with sexual abuse from a big scandal that they had at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. And I wrote a 3-year plan for the military and briefed it to Congress. And after the first year, I was due to retire, and the Secretary of the Army says, "Nope, I'll retire you and call you back." So I had a big retirement ceremony where I reviewed all the troops from the 3rd Infantry Division, and the next day I was back at work in my desk with the same uniform. And then 2 years later, when that program was done, I was going to retire again, and I got a call from Secretary of Defense's office. And they said, "We've talked to all 3 chiefs of chaplains, and they say there's nobody who has more international experience than you because you've had European command. And so we'd like you to stay on 2 or 3 more years and go work at the State Department for the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom," which was just a new office that was created in the State Department by Congress because there were real problems with international religious freedom. And so I worked there 2 years, and then I realized I was working for 1/3 of my salary, because if I retired, I'd get 3/4. So I was working for 1/4 of my salary, and this is crazy.
I want to get back to, because as you know, there's been occasionally the media will pop up with a story, play it to death, and then suddenly it disappears. But you mentioned sexual harassment earlier, and it's something that has, of course, come up in our own time now with the wars going on. But what was that about? I mean, you mentioned an incident, but you actually addressed it, so something serious was going on. What was it?
Well, Aberdeen Proving Grounds was a training area, and what some of the senior non-commissioned officers were doing was doing things like, after they went out on bivouac and stuff, they would go hop in the showers with the girls just like they hopped in the showers with the guys. And there was other kind of sexual innuendos, and the when you're dealing in a hierarchical structure where there's so much power at the top and there's not much power at the bottom, and you're dealing with a minority group that's trying to make it and in the military and will do almost anything to prove themselves successful, then they become very, very subject to sexual abuse. And the Secretary of the Army commissioned one report, and the Inspector General of the Army did another report. And I had just gotten back from Germany, and the general who was in charge of personnel asked the chief of chaplains, "Where's Keizer?" And because I'd worked with him once before. And chief said, "Well, he's here, he's going to take some leave, and then he's going to come and work for me." And the general in charge of personnel was 3 stars, and the chief of chaplains was 2. And he says, "Don, I got 3 stars, you got 2. He's going to work for me. Tell him his leave is canceled. Come and see me tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock. So 5 o'clock the next morning I was in. They locked me in a room and let me read the reports, and I couldn't take any notes. Had no pencil, no paper, just had to read them. And then when I finished, I went in and reported to the general. I says, if this gets out before the secretary has a plan, Congress is going to eat the Army like crazy. And he says, "That's what I thought. You got to write me a plan. Who do you need to help?" I named about 25 people some I knew, some whose specialty I really thought I need, like some good lawyers and some good doctors. And so about 25 names. Monday morning when I got in at 6 o'clock, walked into his conference room, and there were 25 people sitting around chairs. And we worked, they read the reports the first day. Then that night we started doing some brain work and just, seeing what we could think about. And we stopped about 9 o'clock at night. They came back at about 7 the next morning. And the whole next day we worked on more brainstorming and putting stuff on charts. And there were some really good ideas that came out of that group. And they're some smart guys. And so I told the general that I had enough stuff. What I needed was 2 stenographers and somebody who could help with graphics. So Tuesday night I stayed all night and worked all night on getting it done by dictating to secretaries and working on graphics with this graphics guy. And then my group came back in the afternoon on Wednesday and went over what I had put together. We made some corrections, and then Thursday afternoon we briefed the general, and he said, "Okay, tomorrow you brief the chief of staff and the secretary." So I briefed the chief of staff and the secretary, and the secretary said, "Be prepared Monday. You're going on the Hill and you're going to brief the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee." And so I did, and it went across. But
that's the technical details of how you put all this together. And obviously it took a lot of work from a lot of different people. But in effect, what were you saying?
Well, trying to identify what some of the real problems were. And part of the problem was that it was all done internally. And so not everybody had the same kind of value sets for women being in the military. I mean, let's face it, the military was a very chauvinistic organization, and when the women were in, they were in a WAC corps, which was off to the side. And when they started to integrate them, that's when they had problems. And fortunately, at that time, the Army had a black secretary of the Army, and he understood what it was like to integrate a workforce. And so he wrote a regulation on what the relationship should be between different ranks. But nobody really followed that. And so that's where you got all that kind of trouble. And then there was, women being the minority, they were very, very vulnerable people. And the one recommendation that they didn't accept that I made was that they take all the adjudication away from the commander and put it in a separate thing. And that's still what Congress is toying around with now. I mean, and that was in, let's see, that was 2000 or 1998 when I wrote that. And here we are, 2015, and it still isn't fixed.
Yeah. Tell us about 9/11.
I was at the State Department at 9/11, and we didn't have an ambassador at that time because the ambassador had just retired or resigned. And one of my fellow workmates came in and said, "Let's turn on the TV. I hear a plane just hit one of the Twin Towers." So we turned it on, and we saw just in time to see the second airplane hit. And then there was an alarm that sounded in the State Department that there were a bomb alert. So everybody had to get out. And I was in charge of security, so I had to go around and pick out all of the secret hard drives out of all of the computers and put them in my safe. And then I went out, everybody's standing around, and I went to one of the undersecretaries and I said, "Sir, you got to tell these people to go home. They're not going to get back in this 8-story building if you got to get sniffer dogs out sniffing for a bomb. And if somebody really is important, they need to be able to be contacted. So let them congregate at this one place, and so that there's contact with them, but the rest of them should go home. And tell them not to all go to the same subway." And I was in uniform because I was going to have lunch at the Pentagon that day. And so he says, "You look more official than I do. So why don't you tell them?" So I sent them away on one side, then he took me around to the other side. I sent a bunch of them away from there. And then I walked over the bridge, the Memorial Bridge by the Lincoln Monument, and then walked over to the Pentagon. And as I was walking over, they would say, "Hey, you can't go." And then they'd see the cross and they'd say, "Chaplain, they probably need you. Go ahead." And so I got there just in time when they were going to go in and try and get some bodies out. So I had done an exercise when I was in the Pentagon on how to set up a morgue in case there was something. So one of the general officers asked me if I would be in charge of that. So we got some volunteers. We cordoned off an area, but it was still too hot to go into the building, Frank. It was just terrible. So they said, "We'll get some, by the time we can get in there, we'll get some refrigerator trucks." So we tore down that morgue, and then I went in the inside of the Pentagon because the Pentagon's got that center corridor, and some of the first responders were going in there. And so we ministered to the first responders, and then I had a car, and I knew that some of the people who worked there were in hospitals in the area. So I drove around and visited some of the hospitals because there were a lot of chaplains. All the Unified Command chaplains were in town. That's who I was going to speak to over lunch. So, and they were all working, and but it was really, I lost 45 friends and acquaintances that day, so it was a rough day. And then in the morning I went in very early to the State Department because I had all of those secret things in my safe. And I got a call from the colonel who worked with Colin Powell, and Powell was flying around because he wasn't in Washington. And so I got the call. He says, "Come on up here. Secretary Powell wants to talk to you." And I said, "Oh boy, I'm gonna get my butt chewed for sending all these people home." And so I got in, and he put me on the phone with Powell, and I said, "How are you, sir?" He says, "Well, bad day, Herman." And I said, "Yes, sir, it is." He says, "I understand you sent all of my people home." I said, "Yes, sir, I did." He says, good for you. And you know, a lot of the tension went up.
Yeah.
But then at 3 o'clock, I got another call that the Secretary of the Army had asked the Secretary of State if I could come back and work in the Pentagon, because the guy who normally worked the emergency center for the chief of chaplains was in California. And he couldn't rent a car, couldn't rent roller skates even to get back. So he was stuck out there. So I spent 3 days and 3 nights in the Pentagon working on calling up some reservists and dealing with how are we going to handle the families. And you know, it's amazing how under pressure some people who are really bright suddenly lose their mind. They wanted the families to go on each of the installations. So they're going to open up an Army base, a naval base, and you know, and people were going to come in. I said, hey, wait a minute, you just upped the code so that, you know, it makes it more difficult to come in, and now you're going to invite parents in who are wondering? I said, come on, be serious. What do you think we should do? I said, I think you should rent a hotel in Crystal City and put all of the assets there that can help these people and let them go there and have place to sleep, place to park, and all that kind of stuff. So one of the guys who worked for the Secretary of Defense was sitting in on the meeting. He says, I'm going to sell that to the Secretary right now, so I'm going to go up. You want to come with me? I said, sure. So we went up to the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary said, Chaplain Keizer, you're absolutely right. That's what we're going to do. And so that made it a lot easier for the families and everything coming.
Now, Herm, given all these experiences, including Vietnam, 9/11, you came to some kind of a, was it an epiphany, or is it a moment, or is it something that gradually happened where you decided that you wanted to devote part of your life, or maybe most of your life, to this concept of moral injury?
Well, I always was concerned about the moral health of soldiers, because they did some things that you don't do in civilian life. And especially the reservists come back and they don't have anybody to talk to about that. Guys like me who stayed in, we had a whole cohort of guys who had done the same kind of thing that we had, and we could get together and we knew when we were bullshitting one another and when we were telling the truth. But the poor guys who were in the reserves always went out and they didn't have anybody to talk to. So I was always concerned about that part of the population. Then in 2009, 2 women from the West Coast wanted to do a truth commission on conscience and war. And so they were looking for a military person to be the guest host. They called President Carter, he could do it. You know, so they ran out of the real big shots, and then they called 2 of the West Point commandants, and both of them said, if you want to have somebody who could be a good host for you, get Chaplain Herman Keizer. He's retired, and he could do a good job for you. So while they were planning, I had been working with this guy who had produced a DVD on the Soldiers of Conscience, and he was part of their group that was looking at setting up this truth commission. So they're sitting at supper one time, and Rita Brock says, we need to get a military person. And the 2 commandants of West Point always talked about this Chaplain Herman Keizer. And Ian said, I know Herm. I work with him. I talk to him every week. And so they said, okay. So they called me up and said, would you be? And I said, sure. So I was the guest host And the first meeting we had was in Riverside Church in New York City. And we had about 80 or 90 commissioners that agreed to work for a year and share input. And the students in California were going to sort through that, and I was going to help them sort through that stuff. And in 2009, there was also a paper that was put out by the VA, a guy named Litz, and a couple other his cohorts. And what they were finding out was that they could take care of PTSD, but as soon as they fixed the PTSD, they got into some very, very serious religious questions, like, can God love me anymore? And they said, we're not trained to answer those. And so they put out this thing, and then they put together, I think, an 8-step protocol. And when Rita and I read it, it sounded just like the old penance in the old church. And during the first 3 centuries of the church, it wasn't that the church was pacifist, it's just that the church could not serve in the Roman military because the Roman military had to pay allegiance to Caesar, who was God.
Right.
And so when they wanted to change to Christianity, they had to spend 9 months in penitence so that they could make the switch from Caesar as God to Jesus as God. And so that's a long time to be in penance. But every society, as we started looking at it, every society has some kind of rituals for warriors that helps reintegrate them into the society. The Navajo Indians, for instance, have a ritual that they go through, and everyone in the tribe has to attend at least 2 of these a year. So if here's a family who's got this, and they invite everybody in, so it's a big gaggle of folks. And there's shamans that go through all of this stuff, and you know, it's like memorizing all of Hegel's or not Hegel, Johann Sebastian Bach music, okay? Because it all has to come out of there. So it's all in that oral tradition, and they go through it. And one of the guys who was in Vietnam went through that, and he was okay, and he was one of the code talkers from World War II. And when they lifted the secret stuff from the code talkers, he could talk about it again, and it came back, and so they had to do another ceremony for him. But the ceremony was a way for them to get right back into the community. And so the 2 things that really became important was the ability for people to tell their story, and second, to be able to tell that story in a community that was a community that would accept them, that would be non-judgmental, that would see their positive worth and have positive regard for them and have empathy. And so one of the things that we said is the religious communities could do that. And so we wrote after the Truth Commission, they came up with 2 things. One was selective conscientious objection, and the other one was moral injury in war. And so Rita and another friend of hers and I wrote some way to get some money, and we sent our grant request, and Lilly Foundation gave us $650,000 for 2 years. And in that process of writing that, Rita said, you know, what would be good, Herm, is if you would think back to what you did in the military when you were in Vietnam, and were you doing something pastoral that now makes more sense to you, but at that time it was more intuitive. And that was an interesting exercise. It really was. I went back to trying to figure out just exactly what I was doing. And one of the things I found out is that in the second week, I was going along Highway 1, and my predecessor had told me he'd done everything he could for these guys who were guarding the road. They got all kinds of literature. They had enough Bibles they could make beds out of and all that kind of stuff. And so I stopped at this first track vehicle, and it was a tank. And I said to the guys, when's the last time you had communion? None of them had communion all the while they were in country. So I said, would you like to have communion? And they said, yeah. So when I broke the bread, I said, you know, this lets us know that God experiences the same kind of suffering and views the same kind of privation that you see and experience every day. So God participates in our suffering. I said, but after the Paschal feast was celebrated, it says after supper he took a cup. So this is new. This is not part of the old service. This is a new service. And he says, this cup is the new covenant or the New Testament in my blood. Drink it in remembrance of me. And I said, that's the cup of hope. And so every service I had from that time on, I served communion. And it was just magnificent for these guys because, God was there with them in their suffering, and yet they still had hope. And the other thing I did was I used the Psalms a lot because that's a fantastic book. I mean, the Jews know how to pray to God. They really did. We Protestants don't know how to do that at all. I mean, they pull God down by the ear and say, "Come here, you've got part of this stuff too. You made a covenant with us." And look what they're saying. Where is Israel's God? He says, you got a part of this business. And when guys were really angry at God, I would give them the imprecatory Psalms to read. And the imprecatory Psalms are Psalms where people are really angry at God and angry at their enemy. Like, may his bones dry up, may his progeny never experience anything. And, you read some of that stuff and, but they would read them. And, they would look, and it was always the same kind of thing. They'd close the Bible, they'd look at the front page, they'd open it up and look at the title page and see who did it. And he said, is this in my Bible too? And I said, yeah, it's not just Chaplain's Bible. And the other Psalms were the Psalms of Lament. And every one of the Psalms of Lament have the same kind of pattern. It begins with somebody having a real complaint against God. And because somebody's bothering him or something else, but he really has a complaint against God. So he brings that complaint to God. And then in the process of bringing that complaint, he remembers that he's been there before with other complaints. And that this is not unusual for him to be talking to God this way. And as he does that, he begins to remember how gracious and merciful and trustworthy God is. And so the healing just begins to flow over him again, and or her. And so they were very, very helpful in helping people deal with lamentation. And there was a lot of laments amongst the veterans, and the veterans coming back from these wars have a lot of laments. And
it's interesting, Herm, that you mentioned that the American Indian tradition and then the Judeo-Christian tradition. But in effect, they're doing it in their own different ways. They're trying to heal, if you will, but to bring back that person to their community, bring their self back to be part of the group.
And that's, I've done some research on some of the African tribes, and they do the same thing. The early church with its 9-month kind of thing, you know, so there was a real sense of war is alienating people from the normal society that they live in, no matter how well we train them.
Yeah.
And we do train them well. And, you know, I used to wonder about the morality of that, because we train our soldiers to be really not anything but, they're reflexive, that's it. They don't reflect on anything, they just, that's it. And, but I talked to a lot of the commanders, and the commanders would say, my job is to train them to survive on the battlefield. And I have to do that. One of the weakest parts for the military is taking that morality of war out of the soldier. And so you have people come back, and I did a thing on the tremendous amount of loss that soldiers experience when they leave the military. One is the unit that they have is a tight-knit unit. They have a lot of good friends. So all of a sudden they lose that. The mission that they're on is always talked about as something very, very important. Not like picking up garbage on a garbage truck. I mean, this is something really important. And all of a sudden they go back into civilian life and they're picking up garbage. And one that people forget a lot about is the weapon and the loss of the weapon and the feeling of loss of security. And there's, you know, when you put all those losses together, you really get a pattern of tremendous amount of grief that happens with soldiers coming back. And that grief, they do something with that grief, and either that grief turns to guilt or it turns to shame. And
What is the difference?
there's a lot of difference. The guilt is always against some kind of standard, and most of the guys coming back from Vietnam felt guilty. But the guys coming back from these wars are feeling shamed. And to be shamed is to so personalize what you've done that it is shameful for you. And, you know, the first sin in the Bible with Adam and Eve, it says they didn't feel guilty, they felt shame. So they started making clothes for themselves because they saw their nakedness. And so a lot of these soldiers come back with deep feelings of shame and cut off from a community that supported them, and now in a community that doesn't really understand what they've done. And with the all-volunteer Army, Frank, we only have about 1% of the American population has any stake in these wars. So 99%, when they see these soldiers come and say, thank you for your service, soldiers ready to spit in their eye. What the hell do you know about it? And that's different from World War II. World War II, they came back by ship. It was usually 2.5 weeks. And so they spent 2.5 weeks with guys who had been in war with them, who understood what the hell they had gone through, and they could talk and get some of that stuff out. But now we come home by airplane, and you go from battle zone to home ground in 12 hours.
You know, Herm, as you well know, I was fortunate, I suppose, of birth, that I am of the Vietnam generation. And I did go and register to go. And as I've told you before, that going to Buffalo, New York, went there with my passport because I didn't have a driver's license, And he just looked down at it and he just said, "Go home, kid, it's all over with." And that made a monumental effect on me because I could go to college, but it was in the 70s and the war was still going on. But I just knew that I didn't have to go. But the thing that I think there was an epiphany, a moment for me, happened less than a year ago. I have AAA for my car, and you get a magazine every month, and they feature various places. And it's hard for me to describe to somebody who has gone through the war, and I didn't. But as you know, I've done a lot of interviews now. And of course, growing up in Taiwan, it was an R&R station for Vietnam vets coming, or Vietnam soldiers coming over. And so I get this thing in the mail, and there's on the cover a travel to Saigon with all the hotels and all that. And I have to say that I can't even imagine what it must have been like if I was a Vietnam vet and I got that in the mail. Because what I thought was, what was all this for? If now, after all these years and all that death and all this moral injury and all the other stuff that went on, now I can go there with AAA? I just don't know how to even react to that.
Well, a lot of veterans have gone back. Because one of the things that happens with moral injury is that somehow you have to make restitution. You have to give something back. And you'll hear these young men talking about that all the time. What can I give back? And one of the guys who writes on moral injury, I don't like his whole theory because he wants them to go back and buy cows and water buffalo and all that for these people. And the Vietnamese people say, okay, sure, I'll take your buffalo, but none of them were around during the war and had their buffalo shot. You know, so it really becomes kind of gratuitous stuff.
A real generation gap.
Yeah, and it really isn't the kind of restitution that I think is important. But if you look at who goes on when there's a flood, who goes out when there's a big hurricane, who volunteers to go out with the Red Cross and all that, and you will find a vast majority of those people are veterans. And when they get out of the military, where do they go? They become firemen, they become policemen, they go into all of those kinds of situations that are very tense and where you have really, you know, that high sense of gratification, but you also have that kind of intensity that comes because the testosterone is flowing like crazy. And I'm always amazed when I go to the hospital. I visit some of these guys. They all want to go back. You know, I visited a guy in Walter Reed who both arms and both legs were gone. And he said, boy, I would like to go back and be with my men. And he was a sergeant. And I said, well, you know, you can't do that. He says, chaplain, the only thing I'm good for is to be home plate.
What angers me, and I think there are a lot of people that I've talked to that are frustrated by the fact that the ones that are paying the price are not the ones that sent them there and are continuing to send them there. Haven't we learned something from Vietnam?
One thing we've learned from Vietnam is we no longer blame the warrior. I mean, when I came back, walking in New York City with my uniform with crosses on it, I was called a baby killer and I was spit at. You know, I never carried a weapon in Vietnam. You know, and like I told my commander, you know, the only weapon I have is a communion wafer, and the maximum range of a communion wafer is 0 meters, and then you got to hit somebody in the jugular. But at least we're not blaming the young soldiers anymore. We're trying to give them a sense of dignity and a sense that they really are doing something. But Congress has not declared war since World War II. Korea was a United Nations event. Uh, the first Gulf War was coalition of the willing, and now we keep talking about coalitions, and right now there's not much coalition. I mean, Saudi Arabia is finally starting to do something with all the weapons we sent them, but all the stuff that we gave to the Iraqis, they just abandoned like crazy.
And gave it basically to the enemy.
Yeah.
But why isn't anybody at the top recognizing that this is not working? That they're doing something wrong because it's not working. It's a real mess. And yet the men and women that we've been talking about today are the ones that are suffering for it. They're the ones that have to pay the price. And the people at the top are not paying the price at all.
No, and for the president to stand up and say that we still don't have a strategy after 4, 5, 6 years now, that's unconscionable. And I don't know why the generals in the Pentagon just don't get up, walk out, and say, stick it in your ear, or some other people. Because I know that they've got plans, and I know what they mean. And I know that it's a lot more than sending 450 people back in. Yeah. But the president's idea, I think, is, well, I think he really hates violence. He was against the Vietnam War. I wrote him a letter, by the way, saying, that if you should put in effect selective conscientious objection, so that people who object to the war, like you objected to the Vietnamese War, could get out of this shit. Yeah. And I didn't get much of an answer back. But
much of an answer or any answer at all. Yeah, yeah. And to me, what really angers me also is that there's always this Republican, Democrat, but in actual fact, they're both culpable. Bush, yeah. Obama, I don't care. I have no respect whatsoever for people who will send people out. And here's the thing that really angers me too. When they do finally come back, all these scandals have been going on about the VAs. There's just another recent one. A congressman from Boston who was a veteran walked into one of these places, did not identify himself as a congressman, just as a regular guy, and literally experienced for himself. He was on NPR saying, I'm experiencing it. It has not been solved.
No, it hasn't.
And every time we turn around, the media says, oh, well, we're looking into this. It's a long-term project, and then the media doesn't talk about it anymore. But this is ongoing, right?
Yeah. See, on my card, my veteran's card, there's Purple Heart. So I get priority. And some of these poor guys who didn't serve as long as I did, don't have the rank of colonel, and don't have Purple Heart, they get shit on. And they don't have, there's no community around the VA that can help these people heal. And that's part of the real problem. I mean, that's why they can cure PTSD, because PTSD happens in this most primitive part of your brain. It's the response part of your brain. So, like if somebody slaps their hands behind you, and that's a startle response, okay? And that's basically where PTSD is. It's all in that startle response. And when you're in war, you get a lot of startling. I mean, a bullet goes past you before you hear the report of the weapon. And so there's all kinds of ways that you get startle response. And the only thing, the part that manages your whole brain, your morality and your empathy, is all in the front part of your brain. And the food for that is sleep. And so you have guys who are deprived of sleep, always being stimulated, and you wonder what happened. Then they come back, and they isolate themselves and anesthetize themselves with booze and with drugs from the VA, and that isolation also is a sign that they can't be part of a community again, but that's where they need to be. And one of my challenges to the churches and to the other parts of our society is you got to create a community where these kids can feel valued and not judged, because they're not the ones that are responsible for all of this. But the real problem is, whenever a soldier goes to war, he's supposed to go as a representative of the country. And the country is the moral agent that sends them. Now, when you got a country where the leadership doesn't want to accept that kind of moral responsibility, who gets the moral responsibility? It's a poor soldier. And so there's so much of that shame and a sense of hopelessness, a sense of betrayal. And Jonathan Shea did a lot of work on Vietnam vets. He was in Boston as a psychiatrist, and he's written 2 books, Achilles in Vietnam, which describes the warrior and the betrayal of the warrior, because in the first chapter of that epic, Achilles is betrayed by Agamemnon. The second book he wrote was Odysseus in America. It took Odysseus 10 years to get home from the war. And going to those 2 classics shows that this is not a new problem, that this is a historic, moral kind of problem. And we should not go lightly into war. My hope, Frank, is that out of the kind of discussions that we've been having and the work that we've been doing on moral injury, is that we're going to start a third kind of dialogue, that it's not going to be whether war is right or wrong, whether it's national interest or what. It's going to be looking at what does it really do to people and property in terms of how it destroys things. And once it's destroyed, how do you ever get it back? And that's a conversation I want to see happen.
I found a download application for my phone. Somebody, and I heard this on NPR, so I immediately made a note of it and checked it out, and I have it. It's an interesting application because, as you know, the salaries of public employees are a public record. Now you have to go and find it, but now with the internet, okay? I looked up the VA, and the level of administrators, bureaucrats, making $250,000 a year, $300,000 a year, and there's the assistant to the assistant to the assistant to the whatever, all those sorts of things. What are those people doing? How come they're getting all this tax money, and yet there seems to be hardly anything for the person who actually went out to war? It seems to me that at some point, some kind of spotlight, because cockroaches run from spotlights, some kind of spotlight has to be put on the very people who are allowing this to continue. And you could, obviously the president, you can talk about the Secretary of State, you can talk about the defense and all that kind of stuff. But in that huge bureaucracy are all those people. And somehow that's what's slowing everything down.
Yeah.
And you had experience with the bureaucracy.
Yeah. No, if I would have retired and applied for my same job at the State Department that I had as a colonel working there, I would have doubled my salary.
Yeah.
So I was really slave labor. No, I think part of our real problem in our society is that we are really a society that is aggrandizing itself, and we're materialists, and it just gets nuts.
I think you can probably speak of this much better than I can. And tell me about Eisenhower made a speech at the end of World War II warning this country about the military-industrial complex. And it's a great catchphrase. But what do you know about the military-industrial complex?
Well, there was a group that they called the Society of Rome or something that did an economic analysis of what would happen if we would try to demobilize, and so many businesses would go out of business. We sell more weapons than any other country in the world. What would happen if we would suddenly have to stop making those weapons? And we've built our whole society around those kinds of things. And the manufacturing part of our society now is really weak. So you want to keep whatever you can manufacture. What manufacturing can sell on a marketplace is military weapons. And that's the problem with the militarizing of the police forces. You know, it's all over. And so we sell tremendous amount of weapons. And when you look at Russia and some of the other countries, it's the same thing. It's a military industrial, but it's also the universities and colleges are part of that collaboration too. They're the ones that do a lot of the research. You know, when you start looking at what happened at Abu Ghraib and all of the torture of prisoners, all of those things were written by reputable psychiatrists and psychologists and sanctioned by them. And with all their smarts, the average Joe knows you torture somebody, they're going to give you bullshit. But these guys with PhDs, all they know is bullshit.
You know I don't have a PhD.
I know. Neither do I.
But the thing, I guess, that I'm trying to deal with at this stage of my life, and as you know, I've been actively involved in the oral history project with the veterans, is that what can be done to spotlight this. In effect, the economic argument, if you will, is that our manufacturing, they make boots for the soldiers, they make guns, they make bullets. This is what's keeping the economy up. But who's suffering for it? Not them. They got their paychecks, they got their SUVs, they've got their 25-inch or whatever the big TV screens are these days. But the guys you're talking about, the men and women you're talking about, are paying the price for that. And that may sound very naive for me to say, that's not fair.
No, and they don't have a voice. I mean, with the 1% that are volunteering these days, they don't have a voice. During the draft, everybody knew who the USs were. Yeah. Yeah. And the US guys could really keep the NCOs and everything straight. You know, they couldn't say to me, hey, you volunteered for this shit. I said, no, I was drafted for this shit. Yeah. You know, and I could tell commanders off. And even when I was a chaplain, you know, I did things to some general officers that they weren't too happy about. But when I was an enlisted person, I ran a youth group. And I started out with 15 and ended up with 250. And they wanted to do something on human sexuality. And I said, fine, I can get people to do that. But you got to bring one of your parents to every one of these sessions. So after 3 weeks, I get a call from the general saying, Private Keizer, my wife and I really can't make it, but my daughter would really like to come. Can she come? I said, no, sir. Not unless one of you come with. I says, sir, you're a 3-star general. if you can't manage your schedule to take one night off for your daughter, then I'd fire my secretary. And so he came with her. And so next morning I get this call, and it goes into Monsignor's office. It says, the general would like to see Private Keizer in his office now. And so Monsignor Evans comes up to him and he says, Herman, the general wants to see you now. Take the sedan and go. So I said, will you be here to bless my remains? And he says, I don't know, go. So I went and walked into the general's office, and there's his wife and his daughter and he sitting together. And he says, I want to thank you for making sure that one of us was there. We sat up, my wife and I and my daughter, till 3 o'clock this morning, talking about things we had never talked about before. And it would not have happened had you not stuck to your guns. And so, you know, and I think that's the way we have to start really looking at things. I think our young people are off all by themselves. Their parents are not involved. And it's just not, it's just, we've lost that sense of community. And when I was growing up, I knew all my neighbors. I know hardly any of the neighbors in my community now. When I was in the military, I knew all my neighbors. And the biggest change coming from the military to civilian life was trying to build friendships, because people had their own small groups and everything that had been going on for years, and you're an interloper. And then to try and build a community, you know, it was difficult. And when these young people come back, they come back to a very inhospitable civil society.
And in many ways, a very shallow one, because this, I'm not even a veteran, but I get angry when I hear these people say thank you for your service. And I can't even imagine what it must be like for somebody on the other end of that to hear that. And as you well know, I've always believed that the importance of getting these stories is far more important than getting out there and waving flags and having them in a parade doing the Queen Elizabeth routine.
No, I think, you know, one of the things that it's a helpful sign for me is that these vets are much more willing to tell their story than the Vietnam vets are, and even the World War II vets. World War II vets start talking after about 45 years, right? Yeah, sure. And the Vietnam vets hardly ever talk. And if they do, they really are pissed off when they talk. But these young guys are coming back, and gals are coming back, and they're really open and honest about what the difficulties are in going to war. There's a book, I think it's Color It Black, by a captain, Marine female, and she worked in the mortuary. And she did that, I think, for about 8 or 9 months, and wrote about it. And the color it black is because they never get the whole body back when there's a blow up. You know, they get body parts. So they have silhouettes of people, and they color in what parts of the body they got back. And when you continue to see that, and that's trauma that we don't even think about. You know, and I one of the guys tells a story about one of his friends walked into a wood line and got blown up, and they were scraping his remains off a tree, and some of it was yellow. And this one kid said, tie a yellow ribbon around an old oak tree.
think we can stop at this point. We're going to do more of this.
Okay.
I want you to know right here on camera, I'm committed to what I'm doing. And I think that you and I have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.